This story comes from the 21st chapter of John. And John is the only one of the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that tells this story. And it's the third time that Jesus has appeared to his disciples after his resurrection. When Jesus died and rose from the dead, he and his disciples were in Jerusalem. When Jesus comes back, he finds them in Galilee, where he first called them out to be his disciples, 99 miles away from where he left them. He called them out of Galilee to be fishers of men. And when he comes back this third time after his resurrection, where does he find them? In the place he called them out of. And so many of us are like that in our lives. Jesus has called us out of a place, and when he comes to check on us, guess what? We've fallen back into that place. 99 miles is not just down the road. This is a 3 to 5 day trek if you're walking, especially with the terrain. But he's come back not to get onto them, but to encourage them. And that's the way Jesus is. That's his way. He's encouraging them. So breakfast with Jesus. John 21, verse 1. Afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were there. So there's 7 disciples. Now, John is writing this. Okay, this is John's writing. He names Peter, Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, and he says the sons of Zebedee, which we know are James and John. And then he says 2 other disciples. Well, why didn't he name them? John has been with these guys for 3.5 years. I mean, I can imagine he wrote this story and gave it to one of those disciples and said, what do you think about this? And that disciple probably looked at him and said, why didn't you name me? Why didn't you name me? What do you mean the 2 other disciples? Are we just like chopped liver? Or are we just... But that's John. He says, and look at verse 3, it says, I'm going out to fish, Simon Peter told them. And they said, we'll go with you. So they went out and got into a boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, friends, haven't you any fish? No, they answered. He said, throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some. When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple who Jesus loved, of course this is John writing, said to Peter, it is the Lord. As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, it is the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around himself, for he had taken it off, and he jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish you've just caught. So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. None of the disciples dared ask him, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. And this is now the 3rd time Jesus appears to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. I wanted you to look back at this story. We're going to start back in verse 4. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. Jesus called to them, friends, haven't you any fish? No, they answered. He said, throw the net on the right side of the boat and you will find some. When they did, they were unable to haul the net, and because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, it is the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. I've taught this before, and that symbolizes something, because you don't ever put on a garment to jump into the water, okay? You always take your clothing off to jump into the water. He puts his clothing on. Why? because there's a shame in him for what he did to Jesus. And what he's doing physically is I'm covering my shame. It's a physical demonstration of what's going on in his heart. So he says, there's the Lord. And what did he do to Jesus? He denied him 3 times, right? And so there's something inside him that's broken. There's something inside him that's hurt. And so he puts on an outer garment physically to cover something, even though it's not going to cover it. And he jumps into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. This is verse 9. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals. That word coals in the Greek is anthrakia, and it is a bed of burning coals. When you light a fire and you watch that fire for 4, 5, 6 minutes, are there any coals there? No. A bed of burning coals means that Jesus was there for a while, waiting on them. Because a bed of burning coals is when it's just right to cook on. You let the fire go down and you get a bed of hot coals. It says they saw fire burning coals, a bed of hot coals, anthrakia, there with fish on it and some bread. Jesus has been resurrected from the dead and now is visiting them after they had a long night of fishing. Did you ever wonder, because I do, where did the fire come from? Where did the fish come from? And where did the bread come from? Jesus didn't just rub 2 sticks together and create fire. Jesus didn't go down to the store and buy bread. He didn't go down to the store and buy fish. Jesus created those things in this moment. Because when they get there, it says there was fish already on the fire. They caught 153, but there are fish already on the fire. There's bread already on the fire. Jesus has created fire, fish, and bread for his disciples. These 7 disciples have toiled all night with no catch, and Jesus has just rewarded them with a victory, a huge catch of 153 fish. Why 153? You know, with God, all numbers are very significant in the Bible. He does things on certain dates. Numbers are very important. Days are very important. So why did it just be 100 fish? Right? Just an even 100. Or how about 150? Why 153? Because Jesus is making a statement. And I'm going to show you. I spent several hours, I was talking to Pastor about this. I spent several hours finding out why 153. And there are so many theologians that go out there and they grasp at straws. And I'm like, that's not right. But I found a teaching by a Jewish rabbi who studies letters, and he studies numbers in Hebrew. And what he found is what I'm going to bring you today because it rings true to this. What does 153 mean? Because it's significant. It means, I am God. Each Hebrew letter represents a number. A equals 2, A equals 1, B equals 2, and so on. Now, we know how many letters we have in our alphabet. Well, the Hebrew alphabet is different. They have a lot less letters. And the significance of the value of their letters are different than ours. Like an N could mean 50, even though there's less numbers or less letters. N could have the value of 50. So when the phrase I am God is said, he's using the name Elohim. And it is calculated, it equals, when you take Ani Elohim, and you calculate it, he is saying, I am God. Ani Elohim calculated equals 153 in the Hebrew. So what Jesus is saying through the number of fish they caught is, I am Elohim, I am God. Ani Elohim. And Elohim means strength and might. And so there's a statement here in these 153. He has come back, he is resurrected from the dead, and he says, I am God. So many people have said, you know what, it doesn't say that, it never says that Jesus was God in the scriptures. Well, there's so many places it does. We talked about Philip last week when Philip says, if you'll show us the Father, that will be enough for us. And he says to Philip, you've seen me so many times, you don't know that I am in the Father and the Father is me. We are together, I am in the Father and the Father is in me. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So 153 is the value of the letters, Ani Elohim, I am God. Verse 12, Jesus says to them, come and have breakfast. Come and have breakfast. Jesus does not only want to share in your victory, but he wants to serve you breakfast. They recognized where their blessings were from. Look at verse 12. Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. None of the disciples dared ask him, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. They knew where their blessings come from. Do we always recognize where our blessings come from? Notice they didn't ask Jesus, where did the fire come from? Where did the fish come from? Where did the bread come from? They just sit down and eat. See, we don't need to know the how. We just need to sit down and eat. Sometimes Jesus is doing something and like, God, how's this going to happen? How's this going to happen? Sometimes we just need to sit down and eat and not have the understanding of how he did it. Jesus says to them, come and break your fast. Break fast. Come and break your fast. Start your day with my food. Start your day with what I have prepared for you. Jesus has provision waiting for them. Jesus had built a fire to cook them breakfast, but also for them to warm themselves by, especially Peter, who had jumped in the water and was now wet. King David also knew God's provision. Psalms 37:25. I was young and now I am old, yet I have never seen the righteous forsaken or their children begging bread. What David is saying is, I've been around a long time. I've been around a long time and I've seen a lot of things. And I have always seen God be there. And I've always seen God's provision. Jesus already had bread and fish on the fire. So he has enough for himself and for all 7 of these disciples. Where's the others, guys? We don't know. Doesn't tell us. We know there's 11 because Judas hung himself, but we don't know where the other 4 would be. So why does he ask him? If he has enough, Jesus has enough bread, enough fish on his fire, why does he ask them in verses 10 and 11 to bring some of the fish they caught? John 21:10-11. Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish you have caught. So Simon Peter climbed back in the boat and dragged the net ashore. It was full of fish, 153, but even so, with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus asked them to bring some. Why? Because he wants to enjoy their victory with them. He says, let's count them together. This is the way God works with us. He has privileged us to be co-workers with him and co-laborers with him. 1 Corinthians 3, verse 8. Now the one who plants and the one who waters are equally important and on the same team, but each will be rewarded for his own work. We are co-workers with God, and you are God's cultivated garden, the house he is building. Jesus wanted them participating with him, co-working with him, enjoying the victory with him. Let's go see the catch of fish and count them together so that now that they know. See, before then, they had gotten to the shore and they went to see Jesus. So they hadn't counted them. So he says, now go out there and let's count them together. So now that you know 153, Ani Elohim, now let's count them together. So now you know the number. Even in Jesus' miracles, he looks for our involvement with him. You remember Jesus feeding the 5,000? Remember there was 5,000 men plus women, and children. He wants us involved. Have you ever had God awaken you to pray? Why? Couldn't God just do it himself? Couldn't God just answer the problem himself? Why has God gotten you up to pray for somebody? Because he wants you involved in what's going to happen in their lives. Think about that. He could fix it himself, but he wants you involved. Matthew 14:13. Jesus has just heard that his cousin John the Baptist has been beheaded. Remember, Jesus and John were born within a few months of each other, so they're cousins, and they've been raised with each other. And now he's found out that his cousin John the Baptist has been beheaded. And in John 14:13, it says, when Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, this is a remote place, and it is also already getting late. Send the crowds away so that they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food. Jesus replied, they do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. He wants them to participate in the miracle. You give them something to eat. Verse 17, we have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, they answered. So what does he say? Bring them to me. They have given Jesus something to work with. He doesn't need anything because we already saw on that shoreline, he can create anything. But he wants their involvement. In Mark's gospel, Mark 6:38, when he tells this story, it says, but he was quite serious. If you'll put up, you got it? Mark 6:38. And this is in the Message Bible. That's okay. Message Bible. But he was quite serious. How many loaves of bread do you have? Jesus says, take an inventory. And then he says, that didn't take long. 5, they said, plus 2 fish. Matthew 14:19. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. Verse 20, they all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left after. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. God's provision was there. In Mark's gospel, Mark 6:37, verse 37, it says, but he answered, you give them something to eat. And this is a key here. He says, but you give them something to eat. They said to him, that would take more than a half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat? What are they saying here? They think that their provision is in their wages. Your provision, if you're walking with God, is not in your wages. It's in his provision. He says, you feed them. And they said, it would take a half a year's wages. Do you want us to go do that? Which means they probably had the money. And he says, you guys don't get it. My provision is not in your wages. It's in my provision. Pastor Ken right here is building a house. And I'm not going to give his testimony because he's going to give you a testimony when it's done. But he has realized something. God's provision is not in his wages. Because God's doing incredible work in the building of his house. And when it's all said and done, he's going to stand up here and he's going to give you a testimony. And if we can ever get that, his provision is not in our wages. God can provide fish, he can provide bread, he can provide a fire, he can provide whatever you need. And it's not, I don't care if you make $5 an hour, that is not your provision. He can feed 5,000 from 5 plus 2. That math does not make sense. He can build a fire, cook you bread, bake you some fish, and feed you breakfast from thin air. So why do we worry? In God's economy, 1 + 1 equals whatever he needs it to equal. But God. I was reading autobiography by Reinhard Bonnke. And he needed 50,000. God had called him to Africa to reach the people. And he needed $50,000 to rent a tent because he had outgrown everything in the city. To rent a tent because there were so many people. And he had no money. And so the night before he had to rent this tent, he's calling out to God and saying, God, I don't know, but I know you've called me here. A man called him and said, Reinhard, how much money do you need? And Reinhard says, I need $50,000. And he says, I'm giving it to you. Here's $50,000 to get your tent. There was over 50 million people came to know Christ through Reinhard Bonnke. And that tent meeting was one of the very first things. But he had to have faith that his provision is not in his wages. His provision is in whatever God says it is. 1 + 1 can equal anything in God's economy. Lamentations 3:22. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Great is your faithfulness. It's a beautiful song. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. The Lord is my portion. What do you need? Well, the Lord is your portion. What do you need? The Lord is your portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. Back to breakfast with Jesus. Each time Jesus served them the fish, they're sitting around the fire, which he has created. He has baked the bread, which takes time. The fish, it takes time to cook. There's a hot bed of coals, which means he's there for a while. And they're sitting around this fire, and he's serving them the hot bread and the fish. And every time he reaches his hands out, they see his nail-scarred hands. And they're reminded why those holes are there. Jesus was demonstrating his love for them by cooking and serving them breakfast. He could have just given them the miracle of 153 fish and said, that's great, guys. Here's your miracle. I'm leaving now. But he sits down with them after he's baked them breakfast. John 21:15, and when they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? He asks Peter, do you love me more than these? There are 7 disciples sitting there. Peter and 6 others. Jesus is calling him Simon right now, and I'm going to talk to you about that in a minute. Simon's sitting there with 6 others, and he looks at Simon, and he says, Simon, do you love me more than these? Now, what does that say to the other disciples? You guys like competition? What happens when you think somebody's getting ahead of you? Well, you're not going to get ahead of me, buddy. Think about that. What is it saying to the other 6? Well, what's Jesus saying? What's John? John, the one that said that was Jesus' favorite. John's sitting there. But he's saying to Simon, do you love me more than John? Do you love me more than Nathaniel? Do you love me more? Do you love me more than Thomas? Do you love me more? He's asking, do you love me more? Why? Because those who love him more, he is calling to another level. He's calling Simon Peter to a higher level. The word more than, and what Jesus is saying in this phrase, in this verse. Do you love me more than? More than in the Greek is pleon, which means to exceed or willing to go further. He is asking Simon Peter, does your love for me exceed theirs? Are you willing to go further than them? In front of them, which is spurring probably them all on. Peter's not going to get ahead of me. When Jesus first called Simon, he changed his name to Peter. And I'm going to show you these two scriptures. In John 1, verse 40, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, that's Andrew's last name, Simon Peter's brother. We talked about that a long time ago. I don't know why they just can't say Andrew. But Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of the two who heard what John had said and who had followed Jesus. The first thing Andrew did was find his brother Simon and tell him, we have found the Messiah, that is the Christ. And he brought him to Jesus. So here's Andrew bringing Simon Peter to Jesus for the first time. Jesus looks at him and said, you are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas, which when translated is Peter. In Matthew 16, we see him name him Peter once again. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. But what about you, he asked, who do you say I am? Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus replied, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this is not revealed to you by the flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock, on this revelation, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Do you have that picture? Did that picture come through? Did you put that up there for me? It didn't come? Jesus is taking them to Caesarea. Pastor preached this on Wednesday night, so if you're not here on Wednesday night, I'm going to jump into that a little bit. Caesarea Philippi is a place where all the pagans came to worship. And there's this huge cave, and that's what I was trying to get, wasn't sure if the picture came in. There's this huge cave that looks like it goes into the depths of the earth. No one really knows where it ends up. And it is called the gates of hell. And so when Jesus is there, he's standing there, and behind him is this cave called the gate of hell, because that's what they believed went into hell. And inside, and carved in this rock, are all these little places where they would put idols and all these other gods. So when he's standing there in front of the gate of hell, and all around him are all these gods in the clefts of the rocks, he says to his disciples, who do you say that I am? Look at all these gods. And here's the gate of hell. Now, who do you say I am? Any of these pagan gods? Who do you think I am? There it is. Do you see the cave? It's a huge cave. And you see these little niches that they've carved in. Well, that mountain is full of those. And that cave is considered, they call it the gate of hell. And those little niches they had idols in, and that's just a piece of but that's huge mountain. And all of that cleft of that mountain are constant, all these places where these idols were. And so when Jesus says, and I tell you, in verse 18, and I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not overcome it. He's standing in front of the gate of what they called the gate of hell. And he said, this place and all these other gods and all these other idols will not overcome what I've done and not overcome my church. No matter what they worship and what they say. There's actually a waterfall here that flows through the mountain, and it goes into the abyss somewhere in the center of the earth, and they don't even know where the water goes. And they say that's where these pagans and all this say that's where all the souls go. But that's what he was standing, when Jesus was standing. He may have been standing where that group of people are right there when he says, who do you say that I am? And they replied, and Simon says, you are the Son of God. And this is where Jesus says, I will call you Peter. If Jesus has changed his name and says he will call him Peter in the first chapter of John, John 1, then why at this breakfast in John 21 is he calling him Simon? You like to know? 20 chapters later, from 1 to 21, if he named him Peter in two different gospels, why is he calling him Simon? John 21:15. When they had finished eating, Jesus says to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said, you know I love you. You notice Peter doesn't say, or Simon doesn't say, I do love you more. He doesn't use the word more than. He just says, I do love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. He doesn't use the word pleon. Do you love me more? He just says, I love you. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus had asked him a third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. When Jesus met Peter, Jesus called Peter to drop his nets. Leave this life, drop your nets, leave this old life of catching fish, and told him that he would be a fisher of men. But Simon Peter has gone back to his previous life, his previous identity. He's gone back 99 miles. Jesus is asking him, do you want to go back to your old identity? Simon, son of John. Or are you willing to go further? He's asking him, what will your identity be? I've called you out. Why have you gone back? John 21, verse 17. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. And here's the key. Jesus says, verily, truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and you went where you wanted. Jesus is telling him, you can stay here and do what you want to do. Or you can and go back to your old identity, Simon, and glorify yourself. Rest this first. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus is saying, or you can accept my identity and direction for your life, Peter, and glorify God. Jesus said this to indicate what kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then Jesus says, I've given you a choice. Jesus is giving him a choice. He says, follow me. Jesus is telling him, you can stay here and do what you want to do and go back to your old identity, Simon. That's why he's calling him Simon. And glorify yourself. Or you can accept my identity and direction for your life, Peter, and glorify God. Follow me. There are two options here, Simon Peter, but I'm telling you, follow me. What has God called you out of that you keep going back to? If everyone's staying with me. What has God called you out of that you keep going back to? Breakfast with Jesus will transform your life. Find your identity and get you in contact, and get you on the correct path and destiny for your life. Your true identity in Christ is how God looks at you. You're no longer Simon. You are Peter. And Jesus is asking you, do you love me more than these? It takes a greater commitment. If Jesus were standing here today, he would look at you and he'd look at me and he'd say, Michael, do you love me more than them? He would look at you and he'd say, do you love me more than them? And if you do, if you take the call He's calling you to a higher place. And the altars are open. I want to give you an opportunity. If you've gone back to the old identity, it's a time for you to come to yourself. It's a time right now for you to say, listen, this word has said something to me. I've gone back to my nets. I've gone back to Galilee. I've gone back 99 miles. Sometimes it feels like it's 1,000 miles. And I want to get my life back to the identity he's called me to be. I don't want him to call me Simon when he's named me Peter. I want to be Peter. And on this revelation, Jesus said, I'll build my church. The altars are open. If you need prayer for anything, Pastor, if you'll come down. If I could have the prayer team come down, just come down. If you need prayer for anything, if you need healing, if you need to just be alone with God, just bypass the team and just get on the steps and just pray. This is an opportunity for you to just get some things set with God. And one of the things that really transformed me this week is that I can't be satisfied with what I see around me. I can't be satisfied with your love for him. And I can say, well, my love for him is just like your love for him. Jesus is not saying that. He's saying, do you love me more than these? All those disciples sitting around that campfire loved Jesus. And he says to Simon, Peter, do you love me more? Do you love me more? So I want to give you an opportunity. The altars are open. If you need prayer for anything, if you need healing for anything, the next few minutes we're going to spend some time and just spend time with the Lord. If you need healing, if you need a new job, if you've been believing God for anything in your life, in your family, in your marriage, this is an opportunity to be prayed for.